Alright, so it's been a bit since we did one of these. I was initially going to put this on one of the regular review videos, and then I remembered that we had this series, so I figured we would just bring this back. So, to talk about The Boogeyman takes us back to Night Shift, which is something we've talked quite a bit about in this series already, when we started it like a few years ago. And as far as this one goes, it is interesting because the story is just one scene, and so the question is where is that scene going to be placed in the movie, if at all? And it is, obviously. But as far as they executed it, I do want to talk about what's kind of around it, and then we'll just kind of, when we get to that point, we'll talk about how they transferred the story into a scene in the movie. And I was really optimistic about this because the reviews were surprisingly good for what it was, and the fact that the director, Rob Savage, previously did a movie called Host, where it was one of those ones kind of like Unfriended, where it's completely on the computer screen, or like searching and missing and stuff like that. And it was this sort of horror seance movie, and it was really well done. It's only like an hour long, or like 55 minutes long, and like everybody sort of did their own effects, and it was surprisingly chilling. So that kind of put a lot of hope behind this movie, and especially with it being a King adaptation, which I'm always excited for, even if we've been burned many times by it. There's enough good ones also that I still get sort of hyped anyway for a King adaptation, especially one of the short story adaptations, because you're never quite sure what the filmmaker's going to do or the writers are going to do as far as adapting it. But as far as the opening scene, which is a scene that's alluded to in the short story, where this the 2017 It, I think, kind of started a new precedent where children of all ages aren't safe, especially if it's the opening scene of a movie. Because we have this opening scene in a baby's room, and it looks amazing, where there's multiple instances throughout this movie where they have a lot of fun with lights and how lights are used. And here we have like the lights all over the room, and then we're getting this sort of point of view shot from the Boogeyman's perspective, and we're just kind of scanning the room, and you immediately get there's something about seeing things from the monster's perspective, especially immediately, that's really engaging. And then, there's this kind of shocking moment where this baby is killed by the Boogeyman in the opening scene. Even if we don't see anything, even just what's implied and what is shown is pretty disturbing, which, to open the movie with is effective. So that's, it's weird to say, that's a promising start, but yeah, when it feels like, even if the movie's like in PG-13 territory or whatever, the fact that you get the idea immediately that it won't hold back is really promising. So that's why I appreciate that. And then for a while it does become its own story, where we do have the Doctor character from the story, who's played by Chris Messina, and we have his two daughters, and they're still reeling from the tragedy where he lost his wife, which in turn they lost their mother, and we're doing the grieving thing, the horror being representative of grief thing. The whole elevated horror thing we've been doing that sort of Robert Eggers and them kind of started and took us down this new path where people were discovering horror in a different way in the past decade or so. And it's, as far as being a representation of that, it does feel like it's a little late to the party, and you kind of get that vibe. But there's still, the characters do feel real, and their emotions feel real, and that's good. And there are some additions here. Usually I would hate on this, probably, but because we're talking about a King story, it is funny to me that the older daughter runs into bullies at the school and kind of puts up there's this weird line between who's a bully and who's her friend, which is another thing that I guess kind of makes that a slight tweak on the typical trope of the bullies. But at the same time, even though you would think the bully trope is really tired, the fact that this is based on a Stephen King story that doesn't have bullies in it, but bullies are one of King's favorite tropes ever. Like in almost every King story you'll find one. So it almost felt like this sort of nod to King that they inserted bullies into this story rather than just lazy writing. So that's something that I don't mind here, and it actually feels like this nice sort of reminder that this is a King story, and kind of putting his little signatures in it, even if these aren't aspects that are from the story itself. Um, and it's shortly after this that we get the scene that comes from the story, which I guess we can talk about, where David Dastmalchian is Lester, the patient that comes in and talks about, he's the one that had the baby, and all of his children have been killed by the Boogeyman at this point. And his wife has sort of lost her mind. His wife is Marin Ireland in the movie. She's unseen in the book. It's all, like, the whole story takes place just in this session. And so you would think this would be, like, the money scene of the movie, as it were. Like, the big sort of show-stopping piece right here that kind of sets everything off. I feel like this it could have been just as easy to make this the opening scene, which is probably what I would have done, to kind of give it this... I mean, obviously, the movie starts off with a punch just fine, but it could have been that, or it could have been this sort of centerpiece, like when we get to the point where our family that we're following, the main characters of the movie, kind of already get Boogeyman experience, and then this would be like the middle portion of the movie where we get information on what they've already experienced. But so it feels like it's kind of weirdly placed in the movie a little bit to me, but as far as the way they adapt it, it is interesting how some things go in the opposite direction. Like, in the movie, when Lester comes, the first thing he says is, like, close the door, like, close all the doors. And what I thought was interesting in the story is when he says, to make sure to keep the doors open because he wants to be able to see. And then he goes into, like, if he should go to prison, the fact that that's actually a good thing because you can see, like, you can see through all the walls in prison. Like, there's no hiding in prison. There's no closet doors in prison. And you really get the sense that this is a guy that is willing to go through pretty much anything in order to avoid dark spaces or closets or any place that a boogeyman might be. And there's moments where, like he's laying down on the couch, like in the stereotypical sort of psychiatrist way that you think about when you think of this whole setup. And there's something about that image when you're reading the story, and then the way he, like, grins occasionally. He does feel, like, more resigned also, but with these grins coming in, it shows that this guy's sort of reaching this place of psychosis in a way. So we know that camp and over the top is something that David Dastmalchian's very capable of. So I did find it really surprising that none of these elements were really used in his performance. Like, it was like he was directed to kind of do it in a significantly more downplayed way. And I'm not saying it would have been better if he went campy, but I feel like it would have made the scene a bit more... Because the scene as is, for being the entirety of the story that the movie's based on, doesn't really have a lot of flair to it. And I know camp probably would have seemed out of place since the movie's trying to play up real emotions and, like, coming from a place of grief and stuff like that. So I get, like, the movie is taking itself seriously, which is something that you can admire, but I don't know, I just feel like there's something missing from this very key scene that's sort of setting everything up. And like I said, is the whole basis of where the story comes from. I think it just feels too quick, maybe, also. Like, do it in the downplayed way they're doing it, but kind of let it slow burn a little more, maybe, and make the scene a little longer, and let it sort of be more lived in or something. It feels like it's over very quickly for being such a key scene. But that's something I would have liked there to be a bit more focus on. But as far as going with what the theme that they're going with the grief, yeah, it is, like I said, we're in that place of it being more symbolic horror than something, literal. Or, obviously it's literal within the movie, but it's the way it's portrayed in that sort of allegorical way brings back, like the Babadook and stuff like that. Like I said, 2015 felt like where we really sort of went down this path. I want to say It Follows was in that territory also. And it's, like I said, this one just kind of feels like it's late to the game, and like with those movies, it's one of those cases where it was stuff that people noticed after the fact, at least a lot of people, and now that it's like a thing, it does feel like as far as doing the allegorical thing in this, they do everything short of just a full-on fourth wall break. Where like there's this moment where she's going through her mom's things that have been left behind, and her dad's contemplating getting rid of them, and she finds something, and it's just one of those things where a character finds something in the middle of a horror movie, and you know that it's going to be used in the climax as like a very key sort of weapon, and I think they think they're being subtle about it. And it's one of those things where the audience isn't supposed to expect it comes back, but this is one of those things where as soon as you see it, it's like, oh, well, that's clearly going to be used. And it's like, it's one thing if it just happens to show up in the climax, but the fact that it kind of is the big final moment of the climax just feels really, really obvious and really predictable and takes a lot of the power out of it. And it's to the point where when this moment comes, you almost fully expect the daughter to turn directly to the camera and say, this is my mother, and then doing the thing that she does, and it doesn't have the impact that I feel like they were going for, but as far as the scares throughout it, like I said, they do a lot of cool things with lights, like we talked about in the opening scene. There's also, the younger daughter has this nightlight that's like a ball that can roll around, and they do a lot of interesting things with that. There's a particular scene, like under a bed, where she uses it, and it does feel like Savage borrowed a bit from James Wan with that sort of full camera turn when she looks under the bed. But then there's this pretty great moment where the typical trope in movies is that, because the typical trope in life is that, oh, is there something under the bed? And then the trope in movies is that whenever somebody looks under the bed, there's not something under there. So it feels like this big turn on its head when the daughter goes to look under the bed and it actually is there. It's something that's genuinely surprising, because you always expect it to be a fake out. Or like maybe she'll look under and there won't be anything there, and then he'll make an appearance somewhere else. So the fact that he actually is under the bed and the light rolls by his face is really effective and a nice scare. Um, they also There's also these great moments where we see like his eyes in the dark, which is kind of perfect. I think the one of the first posters also showed this off. And that's something else that just feels like classic sort of horror and classic fears that go that are inherent in like everybody. And so stuff like that. And I feel like if they'd focus more on stuff like that, like the things that are inherently scary to most of us, and stuff like that, that stuff that's not as, jumping out of the shadows and roaring at us or something. This could have been something that was really effective throughout, but it is something that kind of wears thin. And they also bring in moments that are effective for a while, and then they'll ruin themselves with that. Like, when they go see another doctor and they do this flashing light experiment. And this is something that's come up a lot in horror also, is the use of flashing lights, where for a while, whenever a flash happens, there'll be nothing there, and you're waiting for the flash that comes that reveals something. And it'll never not be suspenseful, that technique. But the thing about it is how you use the scare when it does come. And this one it's ruined by the classic jump scare trope of everything, like the score goes quiet and everybody else goes quiet, and then something jumps out, when it's like it's just blatantly telling you that something's about to happen because everything goes quiet. That's one of the oldest things in horror, and that's one of those tropes where it's not really, I don't think it's really something that a lot of horror fans get nostalgic for. That's one of those tropes that just that was always kind of weak, because it was basically telling the audience what they were about to get, which is the opposite of what you want to do. So stuff like that's unfortunate, but there's still the unexpected nature of a lot of things. Like, there's a really great moment that's like perfectly executed when the oldest daughter comes home and she comes into her bedroom and she's being followed by the younger sister who's like trying to get her attention, and then she closes the door, and then there's a knock at the door, and you think like, oh, it's the little sister trying to get in because they're currently having a bit of an argument, and then the boogeyman busts through the door entirely. And what's great, the reason this is so well executed is that knock is really heavy, but it takes a second to register them, because she comes in, she closes the door, and she's walking this way, and immediately there's a knock at the door to give you the idea that it's the little sister. But just as it registers, like, you have just enough time to process in your brain, that was a pretty heavy knock for that little sister, and then that's when it happened. Like, it cuts you off in mid-thought of, wait, that was weird. Um, so that was really, really well done. But for the most part, it's a jump scare factory, and that's disappointing. Because usually, when a horror movie gets the reviews that this movie got, usually one of the first things they'll say is there's surprisingly little jump scares. Like, that's typically what you hear about horror movies that do well critically. But so I was a little let down that this has a lot of that. And in general, the sound design is just kind of very aggressive, like at all times. Like, even if something mundane is happening, it's a little, the sound's a little more amped up than it was, and it's like you can tell what they're trying to do, but it feels like a pretty cheap tactic for the most part. And after a while, I'm one of those people that can go both ways on characters doing dumb things in horror movies, because there's times where people will just really pick a movie apart, and it's like, oh, this character shouldn't be doing this or whatever, and they basically want characters to do things that would make the movie irrelevant. Like, the movie wouldn't exist if characters just did everything right. But there's other cases where it seems to betray the movie's concept when the characters just sort of do things that seem mediocre. Like, there are times where I'm willing to go with a character doing something if it just seems cinematic. Like, if it just looks good in a horror movie, I'm willing to go with it. But here, they set up the whole thing of the boogeyman can only, function in the dark. Like, if there's any light around, he'll get scared back into the darkness. And so it's really weird to me how many times after that's established, these characters will hang out in the dark. Especially the little sister, who's like seems the most scared by all this. There's a whole scene of her playing video games in the dark, really late into the movie. There's only like maybe 20 minutes of the movie left after everything has been fully established, and the little sister's playing video games in the dark. And it's like, I feel like I should just say, oh, but it looks really good, the way they used the lighting from the video game and all that. But still, it's like, it's been so established at this point that the dark is not good. And this is where we are. And if it had been a scene that was earlier in the movie before a lot of this was established, I think I would have appreciated it a lot more, like, cinematically. But as is, it's just like, what the fuck are these characters doing? And as far as that concept of the monster can only come out if it's dark and any light scares it away, there's a couple of other movies that come to mind. Like, Lights Out, David F. Sandberg's movie, is something that kind of scared the shit out of me. It's kind of a movie that I still think about when it is dark. Something that'll make me go to the light switch a little quicker than I typically would if I'm not thinking about, anything else. There's also a movie it's not a good movie, but I only saw it once when it came out, like, over 10 years ago. It was called Vanishing on 7th Street, that Brad Anderson directed, and I think Hayden Christensen and John Leguizamo were in. And that's a movie where the darkness, like, eats you. Like, if you get consumed by the dark at all, you turn into, like, a pile of clothes. And it sounds really ridiculous, and the movie is kind of ridiculous. I remember not liking the movie, but like I said, I think it came out, like, in 2012, so over 10 years ago. And whenever I'm in the dark, or I'm in a dimly lit room, I still think about that movie, weirdly enough. And I don't think this is going to have that same kind of thing. Like, I don't know if it's just because I have these other movies to associate now with you have to stay in the light to survive kind of thing. But, yeah, in general, I feel like the movie just feels generic enough that even if I didn't have these other movies to base it on, it would be something that I just kind of forget about. It's not movies like Lights Out or Vanishing on 7th Street where if I'm in a dark room or a dimly lit room, I'm going to think about this. And I think it's because, especially something like Vanishing on 7th Street, is the fact that it's the darkness itself that's the monster, which is a really cool concept. And naturally, the Boogeyman falls into the whole thing of it's an effective movie when we can see like just its eyes, or we kind of see like movement, but we don't really see much of anything, and then eventually we're going to get some really good looks at it, and that's when it kind of starts to fall apart, which is really interesting because I remember when the movie that's unrelated to this, just called Boogeyman, that had Barry Watson in it. It came out in like 2005, and people said the exact same thing about that movie. Was it actually wasn't bad, and then they showed the Boogeyman, and it's like it goes very far back about how much you should show of your shrouded in the darkness horror villain, and every time they want to show you, even if by that third movie that came out whenever, but maybe around the time that 2015 era, when Adam Wingard's Blair Witch movie came out, and we finally saw the Blair Witch in it, and it's like, that's like the whole Blair Witch thing was that you didn't see anything, and so when you actually showed it, it's yeah, and so like and that goes back and forth because there's times where like Blair Witch happens, like the first Blair Witch happens, and people say like, oh, they didn't show anything, that was lame. But then it eventually becomes cool to not show the thing. But then like, you know, the 2014 Godzilla movie comes around, and you just get Godzilla in little glimpses, and everybody says, oh, why aren't they showing the monster? And it's like, it just seems to go back and forth between what people want, as far as, do they want to see the monster, do they not want to see the monster, do they want things implied, or do they want things fully on screen in full view? And it's like, I think it's just one of those cases of, you always want the opposite of what you've got. So it's always going to be one of those cases, but here, just any case in general of the Boogeyman concept, it does feel like the less you show, the better, and that's something we could have learned a whole nearly, wow, that Barry Watson movie is nearly 20 years old. That's crazy. So I think that's pretty much where I stand with this. So it is a letdown, but I do like the fact that it takes itself seriously, and I like the fact that you can tell that it wasn't made without care. Like, I imagine that goes a really long way, and I feel like this guy Rob Savage is definitely capable of making something truly great, because Host had a lot of promise in it, and you can definitely see the makings of somebody that knows what they're doing with horror here. There's just missteps along the way, so I feel like he is going to come out with something that just completely blows everybody away at some point, so we can eagerly await that. But this one it's not bad or anything. Like, I have a lot of problems with it, but I can also see it being a movie where, like, now that I know what it is and I know how it plays out, if I go back to it later, like if it's like October, like a couple of years from now, and I'm just, you know, watching scary shit for the sake of watching scary shit, I'll come back to this one. It'll probably be better in that context. So we'll see if that's the case, but yeah, I'll just hold out because I'm imagining that this guy will make something great in the very near future. So that's what we're going to do here. We're still in the first week of October, so there's a lot to do. We're building up to next week, which is something I'm really excited to talk about, which is focus on a particular director for a whole week. So that's going to be fun. So until all this other October stuff, I think that's it.